fraud doesn't happen. In generally speaking, that often, right? Usually it's just due to inadvertent errors, or maybe the company believes the broker is handling something.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
We're back to our anniversary week here. We're doing a bunch of shows for our anniversary. It's our first anniversary of podcasting, and we're really excited that we are able to present different formats of our show to our listening audience. And some may stick, they may not, so we don't know. This one, I think, may be kind of fun, only because it's one of our previous guest, George Tuttle, said, you should probably call it "What Were They Thinking?" That kind of, what were they thinking?
What were they thinking? Yeah, I know. George did a good and I said, George, we may capitalize on that one because it's like,
exactly.
You've got to be
so
kidding
this one
me,
is
son. What
we're
doing?
Calling SimplyTrade crimes, and shameless plug there, only because we're writing on the popularity of true crime podcasts. This is our version of it. It's a true crime. We're going to be talking about court cases, and in this case, we have a guest who's been a really good friend of the show. She her law firm has been very generous to us, and has come on whenever we need them, and she pulled it off again here for us. So, Andy, I don't know, you have anything else you might want to say about this?
Well, I want to say, folks, first off, again, thank you for your listenership. It's we keep saying that. We are so humbled, and we are gaining momentum even more. I think we surpassed the 10,000 downloads, and we're approaching 100 shows that we've published in less than a year. Things are moving faster, and so we may be hitting 15,000 here pretty quick and going on from there. So that's a good thing. All right. That said, Adrienne Braumiller is somebody that I've known for many, many years, and we both have, obviously, Lalo, but I love this lady to death. I love her staff. We always have a great time whenever we get together. It's one of those where, it's when we get together at these conferences, as some have said, it's like a family reunion you want to go to. Adrienne's one of those that I always seek out and try and make sure I get a good hug from her, because she's just such a great lady and has been wonderful. So, Adrienne, thank you so much for joining our show, and I'm looking forward to you and Jennifer being able to talk here a little bit. But, welcome, and thank you so much for being a supporter of our show, too.
Oh, always. Thank you so much, Lalo and Andy. We really appreciate the invitation. And, the feeling is mutual. You are two of my favorite people, and really appreciate the opportunity to participate in anything that you do. So thank you again for that. Again, my name is Adrienne Braumiller, and unfortunately I won't be with you much today, but I'm going to leave you in really excellent hands. My law partner, Jennifer Horvath, is going to present a riveting discussion on fraud, which is obviously one of my favorite topics. I really like it. But I just wanted to also mention to you all that we will be at the ICPA conference in San Antonio, and we will have a booth there. That's in September. So come by and say hello. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who is a gifted customs and trade attorney. She's an excellent writer, excellent speaker. She's a darn good partner. I can't say enough good things about her. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Adrienne. Jennifer, so welcome to our show, and we are looking forward to having this discussion. And with all this, and as Lalo had referenced here, this is going to be part of our annual, our anniversary, series that we're putting together. This is a new show, and so you're the first on this format. talking about obviously something where somebody just did not do something correctly and has been called out on it, I guess, or whatever. So we're going to go into the details in that in a second. But Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. And so what's the case that we're going to be talking about today?
Okay, so this is actually a case from the Court of International Trade, or CIT for short. And it's called Greenlight Organics, US v. Greenlight Organics. And this is a case where Customs actually brought a suit against the importer, who was a fabric importer. And there are many different issues involved, and it's kind of an interesting and complex and tasty case, if you will.
Yeah, initially I thought, I read the case, and of course I'm not an attorney, I'm not even close to being one, but I read it and I thought, okay, after reading this, it looks like this guy got away with it, because of, you'll talk about it a little bit more. And but it turns out it's still ongoing, which is even juicier. So that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and
before we get too far into it, Lala, let me just say this to our listeners. If you're an executive, this show, you need to be taking a particular interest in this and listen to it. If you are an executive with a company, if you're an owner of a company, and on that, if you are a service provider in a high level and things come across, this is something you ought to take note of and listen in on some things, so that what your takeaway is going to be, what's the question that you should be asking in certain situations? If there is an intuitive question mark on a situation, listen to what happened or didn't happen, and then look to see what should you do in your own situation. So, Jennifer, would that be a good setup for those in leadership?
Absolutely. I think this case will be very instructive. Hopefully, it's still ongoing, so it'll be interesting to see how it does turn out in the end. I know, and in addition, so this is a customs case at the Court of International Trade, as I've mentioned before. But, Andy, to your point about, company executives and just persons at a company, to be aware, of indicators of fraud, or if they are aware of it, happening in their company by other people. There's actually another line of cases, lawsuits that can be brought before the DOJ, Department of Justice, False Claims Act cases. So, and those carry significant penalties in addition to what is owed to customs. So that could actually occur alongside of a customs case. So just to be aware, maybe that's extra incentive to be on your toes and just be on the lookout and make sure and address any errors if they do come up. And that's all the customs want in the end, so the importer is self-aware.
Right. All right. So in this particular case, what was the actual infraction here? What seemed to, once you set it up for us, to give us the story behind here?
Sure. So this actually even started off very interesting. Unusually, this doesn't happen that often. It is starting to happen more often these days. This case actually goes back to May 2011, when Customs actually got a letter from a competitor of the company, Greenlight Organics, alleging fraud by Greenlight Organics. So this person from another company, the competitor, sent this letter to Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and to ICE, Immigration Customs and Enforcement Officer Agency. And those are the officers that really look into fraud investigations on behalf of Customs. So this person sent a very detailed letter. It wasn't just kind of a broad letter, but it was a very detailed letter saying, hey, this company, Greenlight Organic, is bringing in fabric that, they're saying is woven when it's really knit. Those two different kinds of fabric have different classifications, with also a difference in duty rate. Knit being a higher duty rate, meaning more money is owed to customs, right? So the fact, and this person actually got the data from one of those, publicly available trade data sources called Panjiva, which, many in the audience here may be aware of, and you guys may be as well. Panjiva just provides some high-level data. It doesn't really give a complete rendering of another company's imports. But that's maybe something as well for companies to be aware of, importing companies. You can actually send a request that your data always be kept confidential so that it doesn't show up on a Panjiva report, for example, and prevent these kinds of letters. Sometimes, people send these letters into customs and there really isn't, much of a foundation, but the company still has to undergo the pain and suffering, of some kind of investigation or scrutiny. But in this case, it really did kick off an investigation by Customs. So first, Customs had this letter that had very detailed facts, and that was really key to what kicked it off. And in the beginning, and the importer alleges this is when fraud was actually discovered. And this is really what the whole case turns upon, is this definition and interpretation by the court of discovery of fraud. So Customs has a limitation on how long they can bring an action against a company to get penalties if they commit fraud, right? They have 5 years, and 5 years from the date of discovery of fraud. So what does that mean? Actually, Customs has an interpretation, and the court has some similar or same interpretation. And I'm going to read it because I want to make sure and get it right. And you might want to write this down. So the definition is it's the actual date when the plaintiff, meaning the person bringing the action to court, either that could be an importer or it could be Customs, either one, has first learned of the facts of the fraud or is sufficiently on notice as to the possibility that fraud was committed if they had done reasonable due diligence. And it's really the second half of, what is considered to be sufficiently on notice as to determining the facts of the fraud eventually. So in our current case, we actually have a set of 3 different dates where it's argued throughout this court case that that the Customs was sufficiently on notice. And it's very important in this case, why they're arguing so much back and forth as to when fraud was determined to be discovered and Customs was determined to be sufficiently on notice, because that is what actually starts running that limitation, that statutory limitation, the 5-year period. So, for example, if the court determined that this May 2011 letter was enough to put Customs on notice that fraud had happened or was, with reasonable due diligence, it could have occurred. That means that only 5 years from that date, meaning May 2016, they only had until then to start the court case and start the action officially against the importer. However, Customs actually didn't start the case until February 2017, meaning, so if the court says, hey, this May 2011 letter started it, then if Customs waited until May 2017, they're outside that 5-year period. Done. All those entries are, precluded. The importer goes off scot-free, if you will, for that period. Now, after that period, if the fraud kept on occurring, sure, those entries are still open for, rolling 5-year period, right? But then there's there's 2 other sets of facts, dates, if you will, that are also part of this court case. And when fraud was determined, discovery is being argued that it occurred or could have been determined or discerned by Customs. Another is an actual investigation letter. Letter of investigation was sent to the importer in October of 2011. So, you also have to ask, okay, well, what makes Customs send an investigation letter? Does that mean that they have enough internal information, or sufficient knowledge, insufficient notice that there could be fraud, right? So maybe it runs from that date. And in fact, in the ICE handbook, it does say there's actually an additional definition that is cited in the court case. I'm not sure, as we know, this case is still ongoing, so we don't know yet if the court is going to go back to this definition in the ICE handbook. But it was cited that, in fact, sometimes a letter alleging violations with sufficient detailed facts can be enough notice. So meaning we have to go back to May 2011, or at least, to start the investigation in October 2011. Just is it more that date? And then there's a December 2011 date where Customs really issued a formal subpoena to the importer for documents and information. So that's kind of even a higher level than a letter of investigation.
Okay, Jennifer, hang on a second. So we've thrown out several things here. So obviously, what we're looking at is the defendant in this case is probably pushing back, saying that 5-year statute of limitations, you really didn't you start your investigation until February 2017, if I've got that correct. And so they're trying to remove the culpability of the previous 5 years of supposed entries, is what I'm hearing. Would that be
right? This is kind of an unusual fraud case because, first of all, there's no argument about whether or not fraud occurred. We never get into that at all.
Well, that's where I was going. It's like, so are they arguing the fact that it is truly a knit fabric or not? I'm not hearing any of that. I'm hearing the start of it. So I guess that's the other, is that apparently this importer continued in their importation. And is there evidence that they have stopped declaring it as knit and went back to woven or anything like that in their declarations?
Right. We don't know that yet. It's not privy in the court documents. And just to clarify, so actually the court case was filed in February 2017, but all of these facts occurred in 2011. So that means that if Customs waited until 2017 February to file the case, they're outside that 5-year period.
So I guess that where I'm going with this is that, okay, so it's a rolling 5-year period. It could be said that the Customs, all right, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to have to ask this question, all right? Keep in mind, you may have to draw me a picture here. In this scenario that the letter was written, obviously there was something that justified a subpoena so that the records would be, I would assume, somebody looked at it and said there's enough there. A subpoena is issued to prevent them from destroying the records and all of that. It's like, okay, fine. So that would be in December of, if I heard correctly, 2011, correct? All right. So does that also mean in the statute that you're telling me, the statute of limitation scenario, that Customs has to, even though they had the subpoena, all right, the records should be there, it's not an open-ended thing, that Customs has to complete their investigation within a certain period of time to either move forward with charges or not?
Right. Yes, they need to bring charges within a certain time period. Not necessarily complete the investigation, I think, but definitely bring charges. And usually to bring charges, you have to have a little bit of, factual information.
So the interesting thing here is it took Customs from, and I'll just say, again, there was that subpoena to February of 2017.
Right. And
wow.
Exactly. Wow is right. It's bureaucracy at work. They have a caseload. And also, it is interesting that Customs waited that long. The importer probably tried to argue informally, defend themselves informally with Customs. That often happens, a little bit of back and forth. Customs also could have issued some Form 28s, requests for information, in addition to the subpoena. So that means that if Customs issues a Form 28 request for information, the importer responds.
That keeps it, it puts a stake in the ground and changes it. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So it could have been that Customs was waiting for all of that to play out a little bit first until they actually brought, the court case.
Okay, so let's go in. So we're, all right. So, I mean, obviously from a defense perspective, I could see where an attorney's trying to basically is like you said, there does not seem to be an argument as to the misdeclaration of what the commodity was. All right. That said, that means chances are they admit there's an infraction. It appears they're trying to minimize the amount of entries to be held for culpability purposes. If in fact that's the case, it's like, okay, fine. So if that's the case, probably the bulk of the importations were done during that period. Now you go on, I'm sure if they were doing it then, they're probably looking at other situations. And so again, it's the amount of culpability of the entries, which then in turn turns into the value of those goods. So if they can knock out 5 years worth, I mean, that's probably a good chance of reducing the potential punitive amount that they would get fined. Okay. That said, let's go back up. Is that regardless, let's talk about, again, the scenario here where as this has come up, do you know who the players are of this particular case? Was it the owner of the company, somebody that was a subordinate in there or doing something, and that the executive levels were advised of something and some red flags going on? I mean, what are we talking about here so that people can kind of identify with the story here?
Absolutely. And also just to help add into it, another fact that was alleged is double invoicing, meaning they were brought in at a lower price with a pro forma invoice, and the lower price was declared to Customs for the goods, and then the importer paid a higher price directly to the supplier.
Whoa. So now you've got a second deal here where that is definitely an active, if the accusation is...
It's definitely an aggravating factor.
Yeah, it's one where they are actively participating in defrauding the government and paying less duties and taxes on a false, a lower price. All right. So that said, that's two things. So you got a misdeclaration for classification and a lower duty rate, and
right.
then you've got
if I can interrupt a little bit, just real quick, just to help clarify for the audience, just because there's a misdeclaration on a classification, it doesn't automatically mean fraud, and Customs doesn't just jump to that opinion. It's only because it's all started with this alleged allegation letter from a competitor. So I just wanted to, I didn't want to scare anyone.
Yeah. All right. So a competitor, I get that. And, it could be a simple misclassification error. Okay, fine. Here's the garments, whatever. Somebody looks at it, here's the net versus the woven. Okay. However, saying that is that in the course of that, how are they selling the goods? How are they marketing the goods? If it's on their website or in their sales invoices that says woven fabric, and then I'll look at the entry and it says knit, I'm like, okay, red flags, and all that. So, all right. So, but again, let's come back. Is that all right? So you've got some infractions here, some several sales transactions that as they're going through. I guess as it's again happening, who was involved with this? Was it like a middle management type employee or a frontline employee that was actively pursuing this, and then the owners or executives got wind of this and did nothing, or what? Why is this such a big deal right now?
Oh, it's so this was actually a very small importer. Really a sole ownership, if you will. There was a board of directors. We don't know how many people were on that, but it really just had one employee who was appointed by the board of directors. So, and these kinds of issues do tend to occur more, right? Because there's not as much, you know, other people to double check them, right? It's easier if you're just one or two people to kind of do whatever you want. You don't have any internal controls of the company really to double check on that.
Wow. Okay, so as this has progressed on, again, it appears, it's a defensive tactic. I guess, what is your takeaway for somebody out here that is, whether they're a small company or a bigger one or whatever, as you look at these kinds of situations? It sounds like a single employee scenario is probably indirectly has some kind of ownership, or maybe they are just purely an employee, but they're taking the direction from the ownership. Regardless, as you're going through these types of things, if crossing the T's and dotting the I's on a transaction, if, well, this is woven fabric and I'm moving net, or, hey, the importer's actually paying, $10,000 for this bolt, but I'm going to declare it as 8,000 or whatever it is. It's like, that's not right.
Right, exactly. Especially for smaller companies or medium-sized companies where there aren't that many employees, those are the ones that tend to know more about the shipments and really what's coming in. So if you do see an error on the paperwork, first of all, make sure you do have your copies of your shipment records, your entry records from your broker. Don't just rely on the broker. Make sure you have your own copy.
All right. So there's one key takeaway. As a company, you need to make sure you have an archive, a proper archive of your documents. That only includes the entry documents, but the paperwork of the sales transaction or the buying transaction and all that subordinate documentation goes with it. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and I've also heard and seen that to an extent that check what your broker is reporting to you, and then go in and check in ACE, exactly what is on there, because those two can also be different.
Sometimes just due to pure error on the part of the broker. Sometimes they've lost the classification database you gave them or whatever, or they were in a rush, But absolutely, it's what we call post-entry audits. We recommend highly routine post-entry audits. Pull your ACE report, check a sampling of entries, or 100% if you want. It's up to you. And then check the actual entry documents. What did customs declare, and check ACE and make sure everything is correct.
And for anybody that is new to the show or has never heard that word ACE, so that's the software automated. Everybody who's an importer has free access to it and should have access to it, because that's your account. It's your business and you should be checking it. So,
which means, again, if you are a leader or owner of a company, what that does is going into ACE or having your staff go into ACE and pull out the reports, you can see what has been transmitted regarding your company to the government. In a sense, it's CBP, but it's like, getting an idea ahead of time of all right, or after the fact in this case, what has been transmitted by your brokers and anybody else under your EIN number that labels your company. You're liable for that. And you need to go in there, and if you find an error, you need to either get it corrected, or you may have somebody that's using a vendor, a third broker or something else, and you go, where did this come from? And it'll be a good indicator that somebody's importing something in under your name, cutting a deal on the side, and go, whoa, wait a minute. And by the time you find out, if you're not looking, it may be too late. So use the ACE reports. That's it's excellent for that. And it's a good point, Lala. So, all right. So what's next here is that as you're going through, what would be the actions that as a leader should be taking on this? We're going to make the assumption that the owners or the executives of a company are not aware of what was happening, and now they start getting indicators, or let's just say that subpoena from customs comes through, and all of a sudden it comes out of left field, and what the heck's this? what would be the appropriate actions, Jennifer, for somebody to take here?
Well, first of all,
first off, going, oh crap.
well, kind of. I mean, honestly, first off, I would say check with your trade compliance person if you have one at your company, and talk to them with somebody else that's in executive leadership as well. Maybe you have a compliance officer, legal, if you have that, or tax, or someone else in executive leadership, and say, just going to get some information, and then you would probably have a better idea of what's going on. And honestly, I would say contact outside counsel almost immediately, especially if you get a subpoena or a summons, anything official like that, letter of investigation. It's absolutely crucial to get sound legal advice on the next steps on the back of your case.
Is that when you're seek outside counsel, make sure it's customs and trade attorneys. Obviously, Braumiller is a great firm there. There's others out there and whatnot. But I mean, that would be something specific. Don't just call up, hey, your buddy, Joe Smith that's, does family law and say, hey, what do I got to do? Or real estate or whatever. It's like, no. This is customs and trade. And that's where you don't want to monkey it up and muddy up the waters with multiple different attorneys involved, because everybody will have their hand in it. No, go straight to the source and all that. So that's a good point. All right. So talking internally to some leadership, your compliance folks, and seeking outside counsel. So then what?
Then it kind of did. You issue an internal do not destroy order to everyone, meaning do not destroy any records at all anywhere, because when the government issues a subpoena, they want to see everything: emails, internal memos, sales orders, POs, invoices, etc. So we also issue that do not destroy for the past 5-year period. And put it in writing. Don't just have a meeting and just say it,
Well, and to that point, I think as you're going through situations, and let's just say, unfortunately, there may have been something that's discovered and it's not good. Part of the mitigating factors that come into play is going to be, and again, Jennifer, I'm not an attorney, so I'm looking for you to, part my hair with a hatchet if it's not right here. So is a scenario with, they're going to look to see when you became aware of some possible problems and things, what are the actions you took as an executive or leader of your company to, try and get this under control? And if you're taking steps to show due diligence, that goes a long ways as far as your personal credibility as an executive with that company, does it?
And also being cooperative with customs, timely responding to them. Don't try to avoid them or evade phone calls or emails. Be prompt and timely in responses and forthcoming, but not too forthcoming. And that's where, an experienced outside trade counsel comes into play there to help guide you and what is best to say, right? But all of that goes into what's called a voluntary cooperation with customs and is a mitigating factor. It doesn't mean that it'll absolve you of penalties, but what could happen is that you may find some other issues or areas, and those that are not under the investigation, you can file what's called a prior disclosure, a voluntary self-report of those errors to customs. Those will be covered by penalties. And it also shows to customs that, the executive leadership is saying, oh boy, we need to make sure and clean house and make sure our house is good going forward.
But the appropriate, your customs and trade legal counsel would give you the appropriate advice on that as you're going.
Correct. Absolutely. There's all different, it depends on the facts of the case for sure.
Right. Okay. So as you go through that and respond to all this, then the proverbial scenario here is if you find there are infractions that are to the regulations and law, whatever, then what? Is like, do you zero in and, take the employee out and take them out behind the woodshed, as I was saying, and give them a whooping, or do you terminate them, or what do you do?
Probably put them on suspended leave with pay. You want to have them walled off to make sure they don't tamper, with any documents.
It's their access to the systems, the servers, the cell phones, all of that kind of stuff. So all that you'd need to get your hands on that, suspend it, lock it down, all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if it goes to that level, so under the, there was a case, well, probably 8 years ago now, where Customs, as kind of to your point, Andy, earlier, Customs was able to reach into executives or officers or middle management if they were themselves perpetrating fraud, but nobody else in the company knew about it, and able to reach that person directly as well for either civil liability or criminal liability, in addition to any customs duties and fees that the company itself would pay. So some kind of an action like that could be started personally against that person.
And so let's put this in perspective, though. I mean, if I'm running a company and I'm sitting there, and it's like, there's got to be all kinds of things that come up at some point, and you're getting hit with, things and all. It's like your executives get hit with like an information overload. You can't read everything. Nobody can. So as you're trying to filter through that, if there are some issues that come up, it's going to keep coming up. There'll be something, I would think, in some of that. That's one thing. But the other thing is, let's talk a little bit about what should there be as far as from your perspective, Jennifer. If an executive is, let's say they're the CFO, their chief operating officer or whatever, if they are part of the outsourcing and supply chain and things of that nature on a regular basis, what would you recommend that they do occasionally? They don't have to be compliance experts. They've got staff in it. But what would be the thing from your perspective as an attorney that would impress you to say, this is somebody that at least has a good handle on this? What actions would you think that they should be taking, whether it's monthly, quarterly, once a year, something?
Yep, absolutely. So the person responsible for trade compliance at the company should have a direct line to some type of executive leadership and provide routine reports. It depends on the size of the company, what's going on, the size of the import operations, right? They could be tiny, even if it's a big company, or they could be huge if it's a medium-sized company. It runs the gamut. But have some kind of a routine reporting period that makes sense for your level of imports and the size of your company. And then it allows that trade compliance person, first of all, it kind of, have them give you a rundown of the errors that they're seeing, if there are any, or any forthcoming issues that they're identifying. Like, oh, hey, we're maybe starting a new project in this country, and we need to think about this, this, and this. Don't just turn a blind eye to, oh, we need to make sure certain processes are in place. Not only have that person report to you, have it in writing as well, have them send it to you in writing, and then, make sure it's acted upon. If they are saying, hey, we need to do some internal exploration on something.
Well, one of the things I will say that I usually make this suggestion, and it sounds easy to do in one respect. On the other side of the coin, it may be a little bit difficult for some executives. And this is where maybe getting some, somebody to come in and help give them a little bit of guidance on this and setting this up. But one of the things I am always a proponent of is establishing, some meetings where you would have somebody from the compliance area, your IT, your sourcing or purchasing groups, your logistics / supply chain that's transportation related, warehouse and distribution type scenarios. your customer service area and your accounting area, both and mainly on accounting would be looking at not only your accounts payable, but your accounts receivable, but the accounts payable in particular. As you're looking at things on these transactions that are, and maybe you have to include sales in some of this, but as I'm talking about is the point is you have, and you don't have to do it all the time, but you talk through with everybody there and talk through certain transactions, what's going on, and all of that, so that if there is a problem, the exceptions, and you were keying in on some of that, but I mean, to me, it's like, okay, if there are exceptions that things are not getting paid timely in the accounting and from accounts payable, well, why is that? Well, the proper account codes aren't there or something. Oh, okay. Well, let's back up and reverse engineer that. Why is that not there? Well, when the commercial invoice was generated, we didn't, know what department to charge this to. So somebody has to look it up, and then that's more time. Well, why is that? Well, when the customer order is done, and you just keep backing it up. But from that perspective, would be one aspect I think would work, that you could even have that, a couple times a year, once a quarter, whatever, or participate in a logistics council type scenario and that executive listen in on it. What would you think to that idea? And then I've got a second one there for you.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have with a couple of, especially if it's a larger company, what we call trade compliance council meetings. And in the beginning, they would start off having it once a month, but it would include representatives from all those departments. And then as well, the leaders, if you have any affiliate sister companies, have them included in that trade compliance council, if you will. And then together, everybody learns about issues and addresses them, because it could, you don't know what you don't know until you start talking to people. So especially, some companies are more prone to value, additions to value or additional values that need to be reported. So for those, we certainly recommend having monthly meetings and annual, actually, surveys as well. So sourcing, production, customer service, etc. Because those are the ones that are really involved in the value side of things, and accounting as well, to make sure what values are actually being paid.
Well, to that point too, again, is I'm listening to this, is like, all right, so let me stop for a second. To our listeners, again, if you are an executive, if you're a leader, that's one of the key things there, that you need to take steps to look at it. And it's going to, you got to test your group and see, how solid are things, or if you got a weak link in your chain somewhere that you need to look at. And it's not a case of getting of a gotcha. It's a case, let's just shore things up and work on that. And let's make sure that, everything's on the up and up and everything's working well. And if there's a problem, that you'll be able to find it. The second aspect, though, Jennifer, is that you mentioned something a little bit earlier, talking about, the compliance people need to have a good relationship with the executive level. But you took it a step further that I want to come back to, and that is that the compliance people should be putting together some appropriate reports for the executive level. You don't want to get bogged down in the details, because executive levels need to look at the higher level type things, and you can identify trends. But the point being, how many imports have you got? How many exports have you got? Are there issues that you see as a red flag, so that you can look at it? And if you're an executive and you're accepting these types of reports or looking at them, maybe you need to have a meeting with your compliance person to sit down and go, take me through this so I can try and understand this. And it's okay to go, you know what, I'm not getting it. Help me out here, because some of this gets a little complex, but here's where I'm going with it. Is, as you're looking at some of this, one of the other things is that would empower you with reports like from your compliance area to see what you've got, how many entries, what's your value, what are the top commodities that are being reported from your company on behalf of your company, and where is the country of origin of the manufacturer of these goods, and you go from there. All right, so saying all that is, go in and say, you know what, I would like the information from a purchase order, and pick a purchase order from 2 years ago, just 2 years, and say, I want to see all the sales transactions and the entries associated with this purchase order. and see how good your archive process is, and are people able to pull information together. And chances are they're going to come back, well, that's 2 years ago, we can't get this data. Right there is a red flag that I would say, stop it, and you better go be kicking somebody's backside and say, we're not going to have this. Now, they may get upset with you because you're plowing too close to the corn, but you better find out where this IT data breach is, or problem or something, or your hard copy of records. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yep, 100% agree. When we do post-entry audits, we start on the other end and then go to the beginning. But yes, same concept, and you would not believe how many times we run across that issue of all of a sudden it fails when you have the commercial invoice from an entry and nobody's able to back into where the actual payment is. And it actually, lots of times it helps the company and the accounting department to see that and say, oh, wow, we actually need that link ourselves for certain reasons. So it actually can be helpful, these kinds of reviews to help other departments. It's not just about trade compliance, for sure.
Well, I know that there's been IT that have developed data archives for a lot of things, which is good. You've got to test that archive ever so often, because I know that there have been situations where a system update has been done, or there has been a modification to the database that they may be adding some fields or doing something different. And I know this, I've seen this now in 2 different companies where an update was done to accommodate a new data field or whatever, and everything seemed to be just fine. And it ran for like 2-3 years. And then we start getting reports and going, wait a minute, these data fields, these reports are coming back with some bad data. What's going on? And what happened is the archive shifted data now into the wrong fields. And it had been going on for several years. And then they were trying to figure out how to fix it. And at that point, it was like, years into it, it was an astronomical problem. And so there's where I'm saying you've got to test this stuff out, or your archive will be compromised.
Yep, 100% agree. We've seen that issue so many times with the internal ERP systems and et cetera.
Well, let me ask this, so at the end of the day with this particular case, you said it's still ongoing. So I guess there's some legal wrangling going on, trying to say, again, it's they're trying to minimize the time span of culpability is what it appears. The other fact of, again, misdeclaring the value or taking active things to present a lower value than what was actually sold is a big no-no. Anyway, all that to say, what do you suspect? Let's just say that the allegations are, and again, this is hypothetical. So if this scenario played out to be, these allegations were valid, they were true, what do you suspect is going to happen here?
Court has actually flip-flopped a couple of times. The case has been ongoing for 6 years now. But it's been trending to say, hey, it was that first letter of allegation that really started it. And that's when Customs was, had sufficient notice. And one interesting update to the case is that, in fact, they issued a second subpoena just in April of this year. And were able to find a lot of different documents. In fact, they went and raided the guy's house and found a lot of additional documents that could change the case too, as far as the time frame. So it will be interesting to see what comes of all that.
Well, Jennifer, any other last thoughts on this particular scenario here when we're talking about this?
I would just say in general, fraud doesn't happen, in generally speaking, that often, right? Usually it's just due to inadvertent errors, or maybe the company believes the broker is handling something. They just aren't checking. Most errors are the lowest level, which is called negligence. If you file a voluntary disclosure self-report to Customs, you owe back dues and fees, but you don't get penalties. You just owe interest. fraud is a high burden for sure of proof. And I think this case definitely establishes that it occurred, at some point, where it did occur, but just the only dispute is when did customs have sufficient notice that it was happening.
We did, yeah. I'm really glad that we got this done. Again, we're trying to help our listeners get more out of the podcast by bringing these different formats of the show, and in this case, with the crimes. And again, earlier in the week and during the week, we had other formats like the tech one and the government affairs and the just the folks, like just to talking about how someone came up in trade and how they got to where they are. But we're hoping this one, I feel we're as humans, we're very curious. we like to watch people watch, and like kind of like just see what's going on, you know what I mean? And in this case, you kind of like gossip, like, oh, what's happening here, and so we're hoping this will not only pique your entertainment interest, but also your compliance interest. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I hope this helps. So, and we would like to hear. I mean, I want to hear.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to your point, and Jennifer, this is one of those things. In coming back, it appears that, and again, I'm going to give you my dumb country boy assessment here. It seems like when somebody's pulling a stunt like this, they're trying to cut a corner to save money, right? And I say save money, trying to circumvent and paying more money. But in the end, that risk of trying to do that is, in the end, this is going to cost them way more. So if you get, I always make this statement, if you get greedy, it will, you may benefit in the short run, but when you get greedy, it always costs you more than in the long run. And that's what it sounds like. To me, it's not worth the risk.
It's really not. And it's amazing as well. If you actually have a good handle on your trade program, oftentimes there's duty savings to be had, if you do explore it. So legitimately.
Well, and the other thing too is as you go through, I would also submit this. If you are working for a company and the owner or an executive instructs you to do certain things and you're playing that, you may be a CFO, you may be a accountant or in there, you may be a compliance person. If you're being instructed to do something that is either nefarious or something that's wrong there, part of your job is to ensure that whatever you're involved in, that it should be on the up and up, that the T's are crossed, I's and dotted and all that. And if it's not, you ought to look at taking steps to at least document and say, I'm advising you not to do it this way, because you may not have the power to, go against that. You have to, but you can always advise. I'm recommending this is not the way to do it, and those kinds of things. And that right there establishes where you have advised somebody and they still tell you to do something differently. Well, then, that's a record that becomes there, but it helps defend yourself. So anyway. All right, folks. Well, listen, again, we enjoyed this conversation. Let us know what you think. And with that, I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. you should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.